So for a few weeks now, I've been taking us more deeply into the wisdom of miracles contained within the Christian story of the loaves and the fishes. Interestingly enough, this is such a significant story that is the only miracle outside of the resurrection story that is found in all four Gospels. Our final round of delving into the miracle of miracles is a look at what I call the miracle of community. I'm going to take us back, as they say in cinematography, put us back mise en scène, put us back into place by reading yet again another version of the story. Now, when it grew late, his disciples came to Jesus and said, "This is a lonely place and the hour is late. Send the crowd away to buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them food." And they said to him, "Shall we go and spend a fortune buying bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said, "How many loaves do we have? Go and see." They came back with an inventory of 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to sit down in groups. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them. And they all ate and were satisfied. Then they took up the 12 baskets full of broken pieces of bread and fish. There were over 5,000 men, not including children and women, fed that day. So this reading is from the Christian Gospel of Mark, and it implies that the 2 fish and the 5 loaves came from among the crowd that was gathered there. They'd come to hear Jesus speak and to see him perform miracles. Maybe some of them had hopes for a blessing or perhaps even a miracle for themselves. But I venture that none of them had any idea that they would have had the opportunity to actually participate in performing a miracle. The miracle of feeding the crowd that day is almost exclusively credited to Jesus. But I want to take us on a different conclusion. At first glance, it appears that Jesus is blessing the food, and in that blessing is multiplying it. But before the food is even gathered, Jesus invites the disciples into solving the problem at hand, rather than dumping it back on those who are already in need. He says to them, "You give them something to eat." That's a pretty clear statement. And they come up probably with the same excuses that I think we've all used at some time or another. "I don't have the money. There's not enough time. It can't be done. There are too many of them and not enough of us." All those probably sound familiar to each of you. But to me, Jesus held to the vision of what was possible. And he called on the gifts of the entire crowd when the disciples couldn't come up with a solution. "Let's see what's possible," he says to the disciples. I like to imagine watching those baskets go around the crowd as they're collecting food to feed what seems like an impossible number of people. As with every group of humans, we can assume that some people willingly gave what they had, all of what they had, without hesitation or question. My twin sister's like that. She just gives wholeheartedly and doesn't hesitate. Others may have watched with uncertainty, and maybe they were a little skeptical as they were watching the food and calculating in their minds how many people there are and how much food was going in the baskets. And do I really want to put in my little bit of food? It's not going to make a bit of difference. Or they may have argued in their heads, well, if others had planned better, then they would have food like I do. Why should I give what I've worked so hard to have when I don't even know these people? Maybe they finally made a contribution, but it was only because they felt obligated to do it. Or they were just conforming because everyone else was giving what they had. And I imagine that there were some who held back. Maybe it was out of disbelief or lack of trust. And maybe it was out of fear that they weren't going to have enough for themselves. Now, I can identify with all those levels of commitment. There have been times I've been all in, and enthusiastically so. Even if later I regretted it, I still was 100%. And then there have been times I've argued with myself about whether or not I should throw my hat in the ring or my food in the basket or whatever other commitment is being asked for me. And eventually I end up contributing, but maybe it's out of obligation, maybe it's with some resentment, but I still do it. And then without a doubt, I have withheld my contributions to community, almost always out of a sense of self-preservation. I don't know whether that is because of what my grandmother Co would call it, for good or for naught. But nobody can drink from an empty well that comes from us depleting our own inner resources. But that's a different topic for a different day. As the story continues, there is indeed enough food for the entire crowd. In fact, there's more than enough. This community of strangers pulled together their resources, their various contributions that each person had. They met a greater need that was bigger than the need of each individual. I kind of think of Spock saying, the need of the many exceeds the need of the few or the one. That is what I believe is the miracle of community. You see, it's a setup, I think, really, because before this story, throughout Jesus' ministry, he's pretty well established at this point. And the first miracle we see, he turned water into wine at another community gathering, the wedding feast. And he did it all by himself. He has already cast out demons. He's healed the sick and the oppressed. He even raised 2 people, young people, from the dead by this time. And most pertinently, and this is what I think is the setup, we read in the Christian Gospel of Luke that Jesus provides a miraculous bounty of fish, so many fish that the disciples' nets are splitting and their boats are sinking. And it's on this very Lake Gennesaret, that miracle happens. So to me, it is an intentional contrast now that Jesus is not doing that, but turning to the community. He's already shown us he's quite capable of feeding this crowd single-handedly. But instead, he asks the people, the disciples and the anonymous crowd, to access their own gifts, their own abilities to perform a miracle. The disciples are called into their gifts of leadership, which we see throughout the story of Jesus, that they're a little reticent to step up to the plate, maybe even full of excuses. Jesus asked them, solve the problem yourself without passing the buck and putting the burden back on to the oppressed. He asks the followers, he calls them into their ability to contribute to community at whatever level they can. Give what little you have or as much as you want to the benefit of all. Well, as Quakers, we know the value of community. It's one of our core beliefs and a faith practice. It's one of the spices. Community is where we find support and encouragement. When the going gets tough, the community gets going. We know that community has our back. Community is where we find collective wisdom. No one person has all the answers. I remember as a little kid raising myself in the Baptist church, getting in trouble for questioning the answers of one individual. They didn't sit well with me, and I thought differently, but I soon learned that was not the way it would be. We know that collectively we can tap into wisdom to find a deeper truth. We know that if we're doing all the talking and taking all the authority within our community, that we're missing out on other people's wisdom and insights. So we're not afraid to sit in silence and wait for that wisdom to surface from the depths. Community is where we identify new ideas and new possibilities. There is a synergy that is innate in community when we stay open to our own inner leading and to the leading of other people as well. By asking questions and exploring new answers within community, we're able to grow in unexpected and miraculous ways. And community is where we're held accountable. It's where we test our inner leadings to ensure we're not being blindly led by our egos or maybe directed by some stale, worn-out habit. I love calling a clearness committee when I seem to be stuck at something, and I call the community into my own decision-making. I always wonder if James Naylor would have ridden that donkey in his birthday suit if he had not just asked for eldering or maybe called a clearness committee from within his own community. But a clearness committee and what I call positive eldering calls for a community that's a safe haven, where if we're willing to trust others and their leadings as well as our own, we can let down our defenses and give up the excuses. We can be vulnerable in ways that will help us and help others to grow personally, socially, spiritually. Community is where we are called into giving our gifts in ways that we and everyone else are fed. We don't read about one person going hungry that day so that everybody else could eat. Everyone was filled. So it's really no mistake that Jesus handed the miracle-making reins over to that community gathered by Lake Gennesaret that day. We don't know the name of a single person who put their food in that basket. And yet, 2 millennia later, we still talk about what happened there. Each of them had a role in the miracle that transpired that day. Margaret Mead, the social anthropologist, probably almost a century ago, wrote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And I believe that the miracle of community remains in our hands even today while we work for the good of all. And so it is.